Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea's democracy appears to be rebounding on the global stage. According to the Democracy Report 2026, released by the V-Dem Institute at Sweden's University of Gothenburg, Korea's democratic standing rose sharply from 41st to 22nd among 179 countries. The report also says the country has regained its status as a liberal democracy, the highest category in the Vdem's classification. The improvement follows a turbulent period in Korean politics, including the failed attempt to impose martial law in 2024 and the institutional response that followed. For a closer look on what the latest report tells us about Korea and the global state of democracy, we are joined by Marina Nord, researcher at the V-Dem Institute, the very team behind the Global Democracy Report. A very big welcome.
Thank you. Greetings from Sweden.
And also joining us is Lee Hyun, Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. Good to see you, Professor.
It's great to be back on the program.
So let's start a discussion right away. So Dr. Nord, before we delve in deeper, could you briefly explain for us how the V-Dem Institute measures democracy and what the key global findings are this year?
Right. So we stand for varieties of democracy. That means that we measure democracy in different ways. But at the core aspect of any democracy is what we call electoral democracy. And this is the extent to which elections are free and fair, and you have an equal level playing field around elections. So it's freedom of speech, freedom of association. And then in Democracy Report, we also stay with the Liberal Democracy Index. This is the one that goes beyond elections and also checks how democracy functions between elections. That's first of all, it's constraints on the executive power from the legislative branch and from the judicial branch, and it's also the protection of civil rights and equality before the law. So if we look at the results of this year's report, the main finding is, of course, that the third wave of autocratization, the one that has been going on for the last 25 years, it continues. So now 74% of the world population live in some type of autocratic regime. To compare, only 7% of the world population live in liberal democracy. We have now more autocracies than democracies in the world, 92 autocracies, 87 democracies. In 44 countries, the situation is getting worse in terms of level of democracy. And then, of course, one of the main findings is that this trend of autocratization has now reached the United States.
That's a very helpful context on how the report evaluates democracy worldwide. So South Korea has moved up sharply from the 41st to the 22nd in the latest rankings. Professor Lee, what does this rebound tell us about the current state of Korean democracy?
Well, I think you could say that Korea's democracy is vibrant and resilient. In terms of thinking about what was described by Dr. Nord, here Korea's really a response to the martial law crisis, I think really shows that there are real restraints and checks and balances in place that are essential in a democracy. So here we're talking about constraints specifically on the executive branch, and of course, the presidency is the head of the executive branch. And so when you see what happened during the martial law period, you saw the constitutional mechanisms sort of working in lockstep with the legislature, and then eventually, of course, with the Constitutional Court eventually confirming the impeachment of President Yoon. But more than that, you also see, I think, within Korea's democracy, the rule of law and this kind of accountability, where it comes to political officials, officers of the government, there are places and checks in place where high-level officials have been brought to the courts to face justice. And other cases where you see now legislative and institutional reforms that are put in place, as well as you saw even during the martial law crisis and generally in Korea's history, a lot of civic participation, whether it be in response to a crisis where people are on the streets in protest, but also with the high rates of people in Korea participating in elections. But despite all of that, there's also some areas for concern as well. because the current ruling party has a supermajority in the legislature, as well as the presidency. And they've, of course, introduced a number of wide-ranging reforms when it comes to the prosecution, the judiciary, as well as other elections and other reforms. And one concern that I think it needs to be mentioned here is, despite those clear advances, there are concerns that, given the fact that the ruling party has this real power within the legislative and the executive branch, is what kinds of reforms are they pursuing? Is it really in the interest of democracy and constitutional sort of checks, but also is it truly kind of in their own interest? And I think that's an area where I think lots of people are concerned that because power is now centered really in one party, that the opposition is not as effective in voicing concerns about these kinds of issues going forward.
Right. So there's, it's really an important thing to have, and important to have a department that could check and balance the situation as well. But going back to the report, when we take a closer look at the data, Dr. Nord, what were the main indicators that actually led to South Korea's 19th place jump in this year's report?
Yeah, it's something that Professor Lee has already described. It's constraints on the executive coming from the legislative branch and from the judiciary branch. And of course, it's also the quality of elections. Within the electoral democracy index, the one that drives this improvement the most is freedom of expression and everything that's around that. And one of the things that doesn't go into the democracy index, but what we see also in our data is that pro-democracy mobilization is rising in South Korea, which means that citizens are willing to reject authoritarian rule again and again and again. So I think this is something that's very important, and it shows that South Korean democracy is both fragile but also very resilient.
Mm-hmm. Then from a constitutional perspective, Professor Lee, what does that episode about the martial law attempt actually reveal about the resilience of South Korea's democratic system?
So, as everyone knows here, South Korea's constitution was revised in 1987, and that was towards the end of sort of this authoritarian rule in Korea where you had military dictators ruling the country. And so in 1987, you had this constitutional revision, which set in place the current kind of this mechanism that actually dealt with President Yoon's short-lived martial law declaration. So there you had the National Assembly coming together, voting those members who were present to unanimously rescind the martial law, which is the part of the constitutional mechanism and apparatus. And then, of course, you had eventually, we talked about in terms of the process by which the president was impeached, and the Constitutional Court then stepping in to play its role with respect to potentially checking, unauthorized use of executive power. And I think in this case, what you can say is the Constitution has been really resilient in the face of really a big pressure and a big test with the martial law declaration just a couple of years ago. And so I think in this case, you can say that the Constitution really served its purpose here and really put a effective check and balance on this presidency, so that we didn't have to go through martial law periods like we did in the past, where martial law was declared and basically you had an imperial presidency that basically took over the entire country, where the rule of law was not really put into place, but used in a way that potentially abused citizens' rights, and it led to, of course, many deaths in that process as people were protesting the imposition of martial law. And so I think at this point, when we're seeing what the Constitution looks like today in Korea, I think what we can say is the Constitution worked. And it worked in a way that I think people around the world recognize that Korea's democracy really is something which will not necessarily go back back to authoritarian rule, because people have established this democracy over the many years now. And I think the response from the people is very clear. And no one could imagine even today that martial law would be something that could be tolerated, especially in a situation which was clearly unjustified. So I think the bottom line is the Constitution worked. And I think this is where I think Koreans can see that this mechanism was very effective in dealing with the crisis.
Right. So it really underscores how critical these institutional checks and balances are in these kinds of moments of crisis. Now, a while ago, Dr. Nord, you've mentioned about South Korea having returned to the category of liberal democracies. Could you clarify for our viewers again, what does that classification actually mean? Is it the highest level?
It's the highest level, and it means that democracy goes far beyond the quality of elections. It means that you have true separation of powers, and that the legislative and the judicial branches really constrain the executive in attempts to exercise power. And there is the second aspect to it, is that civil rights are protected, and then rule of law is functioning well enough. And just for someone to understand that this is not just mere explanation of being a liberal democracy, means this is more or less the highest level that you can achieve. There is also a degree on this index. You can go high, of course, but it means that it's not only the elections that decide how the executive is selected, is that there is also true separation of power. And I will just remind once again that nowadays liberal democracy, it's only 7% of the world population. The number of liberal democracies has been declining during the last several decades. It's now the least common regime type in the world. There are now more closed autocracies than liberal democracies in the world. So it's really something that is becoming more and more rare. And one of the findings that we also have, that the United States has lost the status of liberal democracy this year.
Wow, you've mentioned it's 7% and the U.S. has lost its status. So it clearly shows that South Korea is showing a strong level of democratic safeguards now. But when we look ahead politically, in the month of June, we have local elections scheduled. Professor Lee, how important do you think the elections would be in testing the strength of Korea's democratic institutions?
Well, obviously critically important, because when you're looking at elections, right, that is the linchpin when we talk about democracies, that people have a voice and they can select people that will then rule the country. And so in this case, the elections have to be free, they have to be transparent, and they have to be efficient. And I think in this case, when we look at the elections that are coming up, we're talking about local elections, regional elections, and I think there's a real test here, because in this case, while we've had election for the presidency because of the impeachment, now this is sort of the first kind of nationwide election sort of after this martial law period. And I think there are going to be people, there have been critics who've been very concerned about whether these elections will be in fact fair, because there's certainly a subgroup of people who believe at some level, in terms of conspiracy theorists, who say, well, those elections were not necessarily free, they were somehow influenced by outsiders. But in any event, the point being is that it has to be apparently and transparent with respect to how these officials are elected. But also, when it comes to elections, the question is also accountability without, weaponization. And what we mean by that is, once people get into power, whether it's the ruling power or it's the opposition, I think there's a real concern that once someone gets into power, the concern is they won't be ruling the country with the nation's interest in mind, but they do it in a way that is very political, meaning in the sense that you will attack your political opponents and use the legal process as well as the judicial process as a weapon. And I think this is the real concern, because we've seen in the past where, depending on which administration you're talking about, people have gone to jail. And I think it's a little bit ironic, because whether or not you agree, and depending on what side of the political aisle you stand on, you had President Lee, you had President Park, and President Yoon, for whatever reasons, to be, of course, put in jail by more, let's say, liberal presidents. And I think the underlying concern is, despite all these reforms and talking about democracy, that one threat to this issue becomes, payback and retribution. And I think this becomes really a big test, because in lots of countries around the world, there's an underlying, I think, undercurrent where people are very suspicious about whether or not the ruling party, or whoever goes in power, is not necessarily looking at the country's interests as a whole, in mind, but really using the process to go after their enemies. And I think that's why a lot of people can be skeptical of democratic processes because of the way it's used in relationship to the power that it yields. So I think these elections will be very important, I think, in terms of what we'll see as the outcome. Because once people get into power, then you have some time to judge and assess whether or not their time in power was used for the national interest.
Now, alongside these kinds of discussions about the local elections, there are also growing talks in Korea about constitutional reform, including tightening martial law provisions and expanding decentralization. Professor Lee, how do these debates reflect lessons from recent political events?
I think these are clearly the reforms and also the laws that now have been even put into place are direct effects of what happened in terms of the martial law declaration. Because in the past, in terms of when martial law was declared, right, there was a time period when the National Assembly could then rescind martial law. But now this will require sort of pre-approval of the National Assembly with respect to how martial law is going to be conducted. And, that is a direct sort of response to the situation where the National Assembly was interfered with even by police and not police, but the military, sort of maybe preventing lawmakers from actually meeting, so that now you have a law in place that doesn't allow military officials in that context to prevent lawmakers from convening. So a lot of these loopholes that you mentioned, I think here are trying to be resolved with this current administration to say that this shall never happen again, where a president declares martial law and then the legislature is essentially potentially locked out from actually conducting its constitutional authorized duty to offer a check against that sort of effort by the president. But also, the issue of concentration of power is really, I think, the biggest lesson here, because there's always been this question in Korea about how powerful the president should be. And so historically, because the president has been very, very powerful, there have been efforts made over the years to decentralize his or her authority. And so I think this will be the kind of mechanics that you'll see going forward in terms of further proposals that are being made to curbing the power of the president when it comes to certain kinds of issues, particularly as it relates to martial law.
Right. So really, in many ways, the reform debate seems closely tied to the lessons from that political crisis and the level of public trust on the leadership as well. Now, when we step back to the global picture, Dr. Nord, you've mentioned a while ago about a striking point about the United States, which dropped from 24th to the 51st, and that it also lost its liberal democracy status. What does this divergence say about broader global trends in democracy?
Well, with the United States, we see that the constraints on the executive do not function well enough. So it's an executive overreach undermining the rule of law, and also far-reaching suppression and intimidation of media and dissenting voices. So we call what's happening in the United States is a rapid and aggressive concentration of power in the presidency. And if you think about it, it's quite a typical pattern for democratic backsliding for the last 25 years. So we know that this is something that has happened also in other countries, most prominently in Hungary under Orban, and Turkey under Erdogan, then also in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, in Russia under Vladimir Putin. So many examples. So Trump is not the first one to follow that pattern. So it's something that is called executive aggrandizement. So gradually the power is concentrated in one person or a small group of people, and then the constraints on the executive power are dismantled step by step. What's different in the United States case is that it happens very rapidly and it happens very aggressively. So just to compare, for example, in Hungary, it took more than 4 years to reach the same level of decline on a liberal democracy index. And in India and in Turkey, it took more than a decade to reach the same level of decline. So there it was very gradual, very slow process. In the United States, it happens so rapidly and so aggressively that I think everyone was shocked by the speed of deterioration.
So the comparison clearly puts Korea's rebound into a broader global perspective, I believe. Now, even so, the report warns that democratic backsliding is still occurring worldwide. Dr. Nord, where does South Korea now stand within that broader picture?
Well, South Korea is one of the examples that we study of so-called U-turn cases or cases of democratic resilience. So there are two things that we know, that cases where you still have some constraints on the executive, where the judiciary and the legislative function is a constraint. They are more resilient to executive aggrandizement, similar to what you had with an attempt to impose martial law, or similar to what's now happening in the United States. And then the second thing, it should be societal resistance against autocratization. And that's something that we also saw in South Korea, where millions of people were on the street demanding the protection of democracy, fighting for democratic rights and freedoms. So there should be always two combinations. One of the factors that we also see from the data is that once there is an attempt for executive overreach, still democracy remains very fragile, and another attempt may follow in the nearest future. And then South Korea is again a very typical example, where you had to go with impeachment twice during the last decade, which is quite rare. But so it's, on the one hand, it's an example of democratic resilience. On the other hand, it's also an example of being a fragile democracy. And one of the problems that I see with South Korean democracy is that you have an extreme political polarization in South Korea, and that's something that, unless this is addressed, South Korean democracy will remain fragile.
Right. So now the real challenge would be how we will keep on building this momentum and strengthen our democratic institutions moving forward. But as for now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Dr. Nord.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Lee, we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on the program.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.